Alright, so today we're going to be talking about Unit 3 and Unit 4 of AP World History Modern. This is going to cover the period 1450 to 1750. So last time, as you remember, we left off, we had feudal Europe. Europe still was in a declining state, with still running a feudal system. The Mongols had actually conquered China, Persia, and many other places. Song China was now in the Yuan dynasty. Indian Ocean trade, Trans-Saharan trade. America yet still hasn't been found by any Europeans. And yeah, let's get started. So, in Unit 3, the first thing we're going to talk about is Europe. So Europe actually expands now as kings start to consolidate power. To consolidate power means to basically grab power and grab control of a region. Also, we see the building of this new middle class. It used to be with the feudal system, there would be kings at the top, then nobles, then merchants, peasants, blah blah blah. However, now it's emerging a middle class, so upper, middle, and lower class. Finally, Europe is now leaving feudalism, as we said earlier, as kings are now beginning to centralize power, so that decentralized powers between the nobles. Okay, how are these kings consolidating this power? They're using divine rights, basically claiming the notion that they were given this power to govern this kingdom by God. Parliament passed the English Bill of Rights because kings started to abuse the powers of the citizen, or their powers, and trampling citizens' rights. So the citizens, along with Parliament, actually passed the English Bill of Rights, controlling the power of the king. However, this didn't work out very well, as kings didn't typically listen to this. There's a new absolutism. It rose, giving absolute power to the kings. This was very apparent in King Louis IV in France. He built the Palace of Versailles, basically telling everyone, this is how great I am. Also legitimizing his power, but also forcing nobles to move into his palace so he can keep an eye on them and stop them from any revolts. Also, the church started to lose its power and became corrupt, starting selling indulgences, so basically ways to get into heaven for money. And Martin Luther saw these corruptions, and he nailed the 95 Theses to the church door, basically saying all the grievances he had with the church and all their problems. However, this spread rapidly because of the new printing press, and this became known as the Protestant Revolution. And new subcategories of the Catholic Church came, such as the Lutheran Church or the Calvinist Church. Finally, the church also went through a counter-revolution of itself. It realized its own faults, and through committees such as the Jesuits, it actually committed to some massive reforms and took away corrupt practices like indulgences. Okay, so this circled region is Timur's reign. So he actually controlled this region, but this was much before our time period. In our time period, Timur's massive army actually caused him to lose money, I guess, or spend too much money into his army, and he could not upkeep it. So what happened is his empire fell, and three empires rose out of it: the Ottoman, the Safavid, and the Mughal Empire. In the Ottoman Empire, the Ottomans conquered Constantinople and changed its name to Istanbul. This was in the center of great trade routes, making Ottomans extremely wealthy off this city. The Ottomans also expanded greatly across the Mediterranean and Africa and parts of Europe. They also they used the practice of diversionism, which basically they took the people they had enslaved. They took European young boys mostly, and educated them and placed them in janissaries. So these janissaries were legions that were highly trained and skilled for war. Finally, the Ottomans built mosques all over their nation to consolidate their Islamic religion and give their people a sense of unity. The Safavid Empire, it also expanded in this region. The main part of the Safavid Empire is that they actually practiced Shia Islam. This was different from what the Ottomans practiced, which was the Sunni Islam. The line you see in black shows that the borders that was actually in dispute. They had many border conflicts, and this was mostly over their difference in religions, because the Sunni Ottomans could not stand by with the Shia Safavids. Each seemed like a sin to the other's religion. The Mughal Empire, it conquered much land. One of the greatest leaders was Akbar. He practiced religious tolerance and expanded the rule during this period. He also established a tax collection system and built the Taj Mahal. These again were ways to consolidate and legitimize power. He created an entire empire and then finally built massive structures in order to. Well, Akbar didn't actually build the Taj Mahal. A predecessor to king did, but for the same purposes, to legitimize his rule. Okay, now the Ming Dynasty eventually expands during the Qing Dynasty. When the Ming is replaced by the Qing Dynasty, it expands. The Ming Dynasty overthrew the Yuan Mongolian and established the Ming. Manchuria invaded and it became the Qing Dynasty. So the Qing leaders were actually foreign. This empire greatly expanded through gunpowder. Gunpowder is a major source in this time period. Countries with gunpowder typically tended to expand and conquer the regions around it. Finally, Ming removed all Yuan characteristics, trying to raise any Mongolian rule. And finally, the king brought back civil service exams, and they made many portraits in order to solidify their rule. Again, the Qing dynasty was actually foreign, so they tried a lot harder for the people to actually see them as their real rulers. So that's why they brought back the civil service exam and made portraits. They wanted people to think that they were in power. Finally, there's Japan. And in Japan, as we remembered earlier, they also carried a feudal system before. However, now we see the rise of the Tokugawa shogunate. In the Tokugawa shogunate, the Tokugawa is actually taking over these small feudal colonies and uniting Japan. He conquered much of the fractured land and named himself shogunate, or the emperor of these lands. Finally, we have Russia. Ivan the Terrible was the Tsar of Russia, and he used gunpowder to expand far east into Siberia. Okay, so this is how empires expanded. Usually they used gunpowder, and they were able to consolidate and legitimize mass amounts of power under their name. Okay, so what we're going to talk about now is how empires actually expanded, especially European powers. These European powers are now going to transition from a state of weakness. As you remember, Song China used to be ahead, and so did many Indian cultures. However, now this is going to change. The hands of power are going to go to European powers. So, first, to start off expansion, they wanted to get access to the rich Indian Ocean trade that we remember happening in Southeast Asia. However, they did not want to go through Islamic middlemen. So, the way that they had to do this was, of course, to the sea. So we start off. Oh wow, my bad. So we start off with. So let's see. Europeans wanted access to trade without Muslims as middlemen. They used prior Indian Ocean technology. Remember the astrolabe, the compass, the Latin sail, and they developed new ships like the caravel, which was small, fast, and held a lot of cargo, and also the Dutch flute, which had a large cargo base and was much cheaper to make than the old battleships. They also had reasons for expanding, such as getting converts to the religion. They wanted lots of wealth, gold, and they wanted fame and power. And this was mostly state-sponsored exploration. So, the first state to actually try to get to the Indian Ocean was Portugal. And you can see how Portugal actually made a bunch of they actually took over a bunch of trading posts. This is called a trading post empire. They basically would capture multiple trading posts at key locations and try to make profits off of this Indian Ocean trade. They could not trade normally because they did not have the resources, and in the Asian commerce they did not really want the resources of Europeans. So, and Portugal's location actually was one of its biggest assets. Portugal has nowhere to expand as Spain is right on its backside. So Portugal is always looking towards the sea. Also, Vasco da Gama was the one who sailed around the tip and went into Africa. And finally, the Jesuits from Portugal went into China for converts. While they weren't really successful in this manner, they were able to spread their religion into China. So next was Spain. Spain's Magellan navigated around the globe. He was the first one to circumnavigate the globe. Christopher Columbus was another famous explorer, as we all know him, and he looked for a path to Asia. However, he found Spain, and once he landed in Spain, he found lots of gold. The gold he found basically told Spain, he should try to go here instead of Asia. And what they did was actually start establishing colonies in these areas. Finally, they actually enslaved the natives. However, we'll learn later that this actually didn't work out, and eventually they'll turn to Africa for the labor source. But an important point to note here, let me get my thing out, is right here. Portugal and Spain both landed in South America. However, they had many border disputes, so eventually they signed a treaty saying that Portugal gets everything to the right of this line, and while Spain gets the left. Obviously, Spain got the better deal, as they did not know that there was this much land that existed left of this border. Okay. So next we go to France. The French actually claimed Quebec in Canada. Oh. The English, like you know, claimed the East Coast. They'll later expand much farther than that, but for right now. And then finally the Dutch sent Henry Hudson, who goes up the now called Hudson River and establishes Amsterdam in current New York. So let's talk about some labor systems. So in Latin America, they used the hacienda system, which gave land to people, mostly Spanish nobles. The encomienda system was a system that Spanish people were given certain number of natives, which they would convert and teach Christianity and protect them for the natives' labor. However, they usually abused these natives and made them work a lot more than they needed to, and did not really give them much very well living conditions. Finally, there was lots of silver mines. When they found these silver mines, China would trade immensely for this, causing silver to flow into China. As we know, the saying would be that silver would go around the globe and then fall right back into China. Finally, they used the Midas system for labor. And Midas system is basically a tribute system, but for labor, basically saying that the people there would have to do some public works, and this would help a lot for silver mines, as each native tribe would have to send some people to work in these silver mines. Okay, so then the establishment of the Columbian Exchange occurred. This is basically exchange between the European nations and the African nations, along with the American nations, or the Americas. So diseased horses and manufactured goods came from Europe and traveled to the Americas. The disease also traveled here, but the natives in the Americas did not have any natural immunity. This caused them to die in great numbers. This was called the Great Dying. Horses allowed natives to hunt and fight better. This was a way that the Columbian Exchange actually affected the way people lived. Finally, crops and raw goods came from the Americas to Europe, such as corn, also leading to a great population boost. These crops also went to Africa, which we'll later learn, or actually we'll learn right now. When slavery was started, chattel slavery, where they took Africans and used them for labor in the Americas, the African population was on decline. However, these new crops and goods actually increased the African population. So chattel slavery occurred in North America. This is because the natives would run away, and since they knew the land very well. So on the arrival of Africans, they would use Africans for labor, and this was very horrible, and they would treat them horribly. So what are these effects on Africa? When chattel slavery occurred, Europeans would actually buy slaves in exchange for guns. This would lead to many states attacking one another for more slaves because they wanted more guns to protect themselves. This ongoing cycle actually led to fracturing of Africa and frequent wars. Also, there was a man to woman imbalance in population. This led to polygamy, which means one man would marry more than one woman. The effects on India. So the English actually used internal Muslim and Hindu struggles to establish lands for the British East India Company. They were able to sign agreements saying that they were allowed to establish their trading companies and then protect those trading companies with their armies. The armies were then later used to expand throughout India, and we'll learn in the next period how much they actually expanded. Finally, Japan. So Europeans were stopped from trading, except the Dutch. Japan wanted to protect its culture and actually put embargo on all trade. Okay, so part 2 of Unit 4. So a few basic terms we should cover is mercantilism, which is basically the idea that wealth is measured in gold and silver. Also, you want a favorable balance of trade, meaning you have more exports, meaning you're getting more money, and you have less imports, meaning you're losing money. Finally, colonies. The purpose of colonies in this time was to make money for the state. There was a new this commercial revolution is when people started to begin to trade for gold and silver. Finally, we're going to look over some cultural effects, some social effects, and some conflicts or rebellions within the people. So let's start with culture. In Latin America, many natives died during the Great Dying. Of course, we remember listening to this last time. And any remaining elements of native culture was burned. The Spanish language was forced, and Christianity was blended with native culture. We can see how Spain and Spanish people were actually forcing their culture among the natives they conquered. In Africa, the African natives were also incorporated Christianity into their culture. We remember the Protestant Reformation increases immigration as many tried to escape prosecution. As new Lutheran and Calvinist Europeans start to form, they actually are under threat by the Catholic Church. So, to relieve this religious persecution, they actually leave to Americas, to the new colonies. Okay, now let's talk about some social conflicts, or just conflicts. So, first of all, is Nat Turner's rebellion in Americas. So, Turner is a slave who kills his master and kills many whites throughout as to send a message about their tough situation. However, this only leads to a tighter lockdown on slave restrictions and so on. In the Pueblo revolts, natives would stand up to the Spanish and killed many Spanish colonists. However, this worked for a bit, but Spanish was able to come back 10 years later and reconquer the area. Finally, Africans resisted Portuguese raids in West Africa. And then Hindu warriors rose up against the Mughal Empire and established their own empire. Serfs banded together in Russia and rebelled. These serfs were called Cossacks. They were very skilled fighters, and they were able to gain some ground until the mighty Russians actually destroyed their establishments. Finally, let's talk about some social changes. So again, in Latin America, the caste system was created due to the mixing of people, Spanish whites and natives and Africans. Of course, pure white people who were born in Spain were considered higher class, while natives and Africans were considered the lowest classes. The viziers rise and consolidate power in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire suffers a string of incapable sultans. Later we'll learn this is why they are called the sick man of Europe. Jews are also expelled from Spain and live in Istanbul, where they live mostly peacefully, except they must pay the tax for not being Islam. Finally, the king dynasty would kill government officials that would not follow their culture. This led to mass deaths. The most notable example is their hairstyle. The king Manchurian leaders were again from Manchuria, and they had their own specific hairstyle. They would implement this hairstyle on their officials. Those who would resist would eventually get killed. And then finally, the boyars nobles tried to revolt against the king, the Tsar. Sorry, it says nobles again, but then they lost and had to relocate to Moscow. Again, the same as remember earlier in France, King Louis actually built Palace of Versailles to move the nobles into that palace. However, in Russia, the same thing happens, where the Tsar relocates the nobles to Moscow, where he can keep a close eye on him. Okay, and then the establishment of triangular trade, where raw goods are actually sent from the American colonies to Europe. Then Europe sends manufactured goods to Africa, such as guns, and then Africa sends slaves back to the Americas. This triangular pattern was called the triangular trade. Okay, and that's it for this period. Thanks for watching, and please like and subscribe, and I hope I see you again.